Elijah looked up at Richard, his eyes filled with desperation but also determination. My mom isn't just being deceived, they're killing people, and if we don't save her in time, she will die. In today's story, we will follow Richard and Elijah, a boy carrying a great secret, stepping into a dangerous adventure. Will they be able to overcome everything? Stay tuned, and I'm sure you won't be able to take your eyes off this story. Richard Hayes sat in his office, the windows of his sprawling mansion offering a stunning view of the lush gardens below. It was a moment of rare peace for him, the kind of peace that had eluded him for years. After decades of tireless work, his company, Hayes Industries, had become one of the most successful tech firms in the country. Today, he was on the brink of making a deal that would change everything. He was preparing to sell the company to a large multinational corporation. It was time, and he was ready to retire, to step away from the chaos that had consumed his life for so long. The world was his oyster, and he had nothing but time ahead of him to indulge in the luxuries he had earned. His phone buzzed, but he ignored it. Nothing could disturb the calm he felt right now as he reviewed the final paperwork for the sale. The deal was set to close tomorrow, and he was ready to hand over the reins, finally leaving behind the weight of responsibility. His thoughts wandered to the endless possibilities of his future, a life of leisure, perhaps travel, maybe even philanthropy. The world was full of opportunity. As the clock ticked closer to late afternoon, Richard leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. The papers were almost signed, the deal nearly done. But just as he was about to stand and stretch his legs, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the grand entrance of the mansion. He furrowed his brow in confusion. The mansion's security system was top-notch. Only authorized personnel were allowed access to the grounds, and he was certain no one had scheduled a visit. A guest? At this hour? The door to his office creaked open and Richard looked up, startled. Standing in the doorway was a young boy. His clothes were ragged, his skin dark from dirt and exposure, his face gaunt from hunger. He looked as if he'd walked for miles, but there was an undeniable sense of urgency in his eyes. The boy couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, but the way he stood, shoulders squared, jaw set, made him seem much older. Richard was taken aback. He had no idea who this child was, or how he had gotten past the mansion's security. His first instinct was to call security, to have the boy removed. But something in the boy's gaze stopped him. There was a determination in those eyes that made Richard hesitate. The boy stepped inside, his small frame trembling slightly but his voice unwavering. "My name is Elijah," the boy said, his voice tight with emotion. "I need your help. My mom. She's in serious danger. I know you can help her. I need to get into your warehouse." Richard's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. The warehouse? His sprawling estate had several buildings, but the warehouse was strictly off-limits to anyone but his most trusted employees. What was this child talking about? How did he even know about it? Who are you?" Richard asked, his tone sharp now. "How did you get here? This is private property. You shouldn't be here." Elijah didn't flinch. He stood tall, despite the visible fear in his eyes. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quickly, his voice low and urgent. "I'm here because I have no other choice. My mom, she has something that can save her life. You have to help me. You have to let me in." Richard felt a surge of frustration. His instinct was to call the authorities. A child appearing on his doorstep, uninvited, claiming to have urgent business, it didn't sit well with him. But there was something about the desperation in Elijah's voice that tugged at him. He stood up from his desk, trying to mask the unease that had begun to creep up his spine. "You're asking for something very strange, Elijah," Richard said, his voice stern but curious. "What is it you're talking about? What could you possibly need from my warehouse?" Elijah's eyes burned with intensity as he took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. It's not about what I want," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "It's about what my mom needs. She's been trying to protect it, trying to keep it hidden, but now someone's after her. If they find what she has, she's dead. You're the only one who can help." Richard's eyebrows furrowed. He had no idea what Elijah was referring to, but the boy's words were unsettling. A dangerous request, a hidden object, and now the mention of someone being after the boy's mother. "You're talking about some kind of, Richard began, but the boy cut him off. "It's not just something," Elijah snapped, his voice rising. "It's everything. My mom, she's been trying to keep this thing away from them for years. She knows it's dangerous. She knows if they get it, they'll hurt her. They'll hurt us. Please," Elijah's voice softened, desperate. "Please, you have to help me. It's the only chance she has." Richard stood still, his mind whirring. This was insane. The boy had walked into his life with a wild, desperate plea for help, and here he was, asking Richard to open the doors to a warehouse that was meant to be secure, safe from anyone who might try to gain access to it. And yet, something about Elijah's fear, something about the boy's resolve, made Richard pause. Was this just a child's panic? Or was there something far more sinister going on? Richard looked at the boy, trying to gauge his sincerity. "What are you asking for, Elijah? What exactly is it that's in my warehouse?" The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked at Richard with wide, pleading eyes, as if begging him to understand. "My mom has something that was hidden. Years ago, someone tried to take it from her, but she kept it hidden, kept it safe, so they wouldn't find it. It's in the warehouse. Please, I swear to you, it's the only thing that can save her." Richard's mind raced, but his instincts began to shift. He didn't know who this boy was or what he was talking about, but there was something compelling about Elijah's conviction. It was as if the boy believed every word he was saying, like this was the only truth that mattered to him in the world. "How do you know about the White House?" Richard asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. Elijah hesitated for a moment, looking down at the floor before meeting Richard's gaze again. "I don't know much, but my mom, she told me, if anything ever happened to her, to come here, to you. Don't forget to like if you find this story meaningful to you and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories." Richard's heart skipped a beat. This was too strange, too out of place. Who was this woman? Why would she send her son to him? "I don't understand," Richard said, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "You're telling me that a woman you barely know has something in my warehouse that can save her life?" "Yes," Elijah answered without hesitation, his voice full of certainty. "Please, you have to believe me." And Richard stood there, torn between his rational mind and a strange, growing sense of urgency. This was ridiculous, but at the same time, something inside him pushed him toward action. The deal he had been so focused on suddenly felt trivial, overshadowed by the gravity of Elijah's request. Richard took a deep breath. I'll help you, he said finally, his voice low. But you're going to have to explain everything to me, Elijah, every detail." The boy nodded, a faint glimmer of hope appearing in his eyes. Richard's heart pounded as he motioned for Elijah to follow him. The question still lingered in his mind. What was it that Elijah's mother had hidden? And why was it so important that it could change the course of everything? As they walked toward the warehouse, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was about to send him on a journey far darker and more dangerous than anything he had ever faced before. What had he just agreed to? Richard Hayes walked beside Elijah toward the massive warehouse behind his mansion, each step heavy with confusion and doubt. He had just made the decision to help the boy, but The nagging uncertainty in his gut only seemed to grow as they approached the entrance. The boy was an enigma, a young black child looking as though he'd walked for miles from a distant slum. Yet his eyes radiated a determination that Richard couldn't ignore. The wealth, the power, the luxuries that surrounded him, they meant nothing to Elijah. The boy was immune to his world, focused on something that Richard couldn't quite comprehend. "This doesn't make sense," Richard muttered under his breath, his mind a swirl of questions and disbelief. "But fine, I'll help you." Elijah didn't answer. His eyes locked onto the large, rusted door of the warehouse, as if it held the key to the mystery that had brought him here. The two of them reached the door, and Richard hesitated for a moment before reaching for the handle. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing a dimly lit room, heavy with the smell of dust and disuse. The light from the mansion filtered weakly through the small windows, casting long shadows over the forgotten machinery, broken crates, and piles of old furniture that filled the space. As they entered, Richard felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. This wasn't just a warehouse. It felt like a tomb, a place where secrets had been buried and forgotten for years. His eyes scanned the room, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the sheer volume of clutter made it impossible to focus on anything specific. He had used this warehouse as a storage facility for all the things that didn't fit into his perfectly curated life. But now, standing here with Elijah, it felt like stepping into a different world. Elijah, however, seemed unfazed. His small frame moved with purpose, his eyes darting from one dark corner of the room to the next. Richard watched him for a moment, taking in the boy's focused expression. There was a quiet desperation in his movements, a sense of urgency that Richard couldn't ignore. The boy wasn't looking for something small, something insignificant. He was searching for something that could change everything. Richard took a step closer, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the room. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "What could be so important in here?" Elijah stopped and looked up at him, his face tight with anxiety, but there was still a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I'm not sure," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. "But my mom said it's here. Something dangerous. Something that can save her." Richard couldn't make sense of the boy's words. "Dangerous? What kind of thing?" he pressed, stepping closer to Elijah, his curiosity piqued despite the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. But Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he continued his search, moving quickly and methodically between the crates, his small hands brushing over the dusty surfaces as though he knew exactly what he was looking for. Richard's eyes followed the boy's every move, unsure of what to do next. His world was filled with high-rise offices and board meetings, not frantic searches for unknown objects in dark warehouses. And yet, there was something about Elijah, something about the boy's unwavering determination that made Richard feel as though he had to see this through, even if it made no sense. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Elijah rifled through old papers, opening crates, sifting through documents, and pulling out random items that seemed to hold no significance. Richard, standing back, watched him closely, unsure whether to be frustrated by the futility of it all or impressed by Elijah's singular focus. This was no ordinary search. The boy had a mission, and he wasn't about to stop until it was complete. "Isn't there something you can tell me?" Richard asked, his patience beginning to wear thin. "What's in these crates? What could be so important?" Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room one more time before he moved to the back corner. "I don't know exactly," he admitted quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "but my mom said it's in one of these crates." Richard frowned. But before he could say anything else, Elijah stopped, his eyes suddenly widening. He rushed to one of the crates at the far end of the room, his small hands moving quickly to open it. Richard followed him, his heart pounding with an odd sense of anticipation. The crate creaked open, revealing a stack of old files and folders, their edges yellowed with age. Elijah's fingers trembled as he pulled one of the files from the pile, his face growing pale as he looked at the cover. It was marked with the logo of a large corporation, a name that Richard knew all too well. His mind raced as he recalled the company's name, a company he had partnered with years ago on a major project. They had been one of his biggest allies, one of the most influential companies in the industry. But now, seeing their logo on this old file, Richard felt a wave of unease wash over him. Elijah's hands shook as he opened the file, revealing a series of legal documents. As he flipped through the pages, Richard could see the look of disbelief in his eyes, followed by something darker, something that looked like fear. Elijah stopped at one particular page, his eyes scanning the text quickly before he looked up at Richard, his face a mask of shock and realization. "This is it," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And this is what my mom was talking about." Richard took a step forward, peering over Elijah's shoulder at the file. The pages were filled with legal jargon, names, and dates. But as he looked closer, the pieces began to fall into place. The document contained evidence of a conspiracy, a series of shady business dealings that involved not only the corporation, but several influential figures in the industry. The more Richard read, the more the picture became clear, and the more terrifying it became. The file was filled with incriminating evidence that could ruin reputations, destroy careers, and bring powerful people to their knees. Richard felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he realized what Elijah was holding. This was not just some old document, it was a bombshell. If it fell into the wrong hands, it could spark a chain reaction that would bring everything crashing down. Richard's eyes met Elijah's, and for the first time he saw the weight of what the boy had been carrying. Elijah wasn't just here to find something. He was here to protect his mother. This document, this evidence, was the key to her survival. If the wrong people found out about it, if it was exposed, Elijah's mother would be in grave danger. Richard swallowed hard, trying to process everything. He had no idea what kind of people were behind this or why Elijah's mother had kept this hidden for so long, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just some random search. This was a desperate attempt to save a life, to protect a secret that had the potential to destroy everything Richard had built. "This is bigger than I thought," Richard said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "Who are they, Elijah? Who are these people?" Elijah's eyes were filled with fear and urgency. "I don't know all of them," he said, his voice trembling, "but they've been after my mom for years. She hid this to protect herself, to protect me. And now they're getting closer. They'll stop at nothing to get it." Richard stared at the document in his hands, his mind racing. He knew the kind of people Elijah was talking about. Ruthless, powerful, and willing to do anything to get what they wanted. The stakes had just been raised higher than he could have imagined. This was no longer just about a boy and his mother. This was about a battle for survival. And it was only just beginning. As Richard looked at Elijah, he knew that he couldn't walk away now. He was in this, whether he liked it or not. And whatever happened next, he would have to confront the dark forces that had been set in motion. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. There was no turning back. "This isn't over, Elijah," Richard said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his mind. "We're going to find out who's behind this, and we're going to make sure your mom is safe." Elijah nodded, the glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Thank you." Richard's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the file, the weight of its contents pressing down on him with a force he couldn't comprehend. The pages, yellowed with age and worn from time, contained a trail of secrets. Secrets he was not prepared to uncover. As Elijah flipped through the documents, Richard's heart sank further into his chest. Every word on the pages seemed to pull him deeper into a nightmare. What started as a simple request for help had now turned into an overwhelming revelation, a revelation that would shake the very foundation of his world. The first few pages were filled with financial records, lists of transactions, names of companies that Richard barely recognized and some that he knew all too well. But it was the next section that sent a chill through his body. Names. Faces. People he once called friends. His old associates, the people who had helped him build his empire, now implicated in illegal activities. The words jumped off the page like daggers. Bribes. Money laundering, financial fraud. He recognized the names, and the more he read, the clearer it became. These were the people he had trusted, the ones he had worked side by side with for years. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes moved over the next set of documents. Emails, memos, and handwritten notes detailing the corporation's involvement in a much darker world. There were contracts, agreements, and whispered promises that led to one undeniable conclusion. The company was not just exploiting the system for profit, it was deeply involved in criminal activities. And the most damning evidence was the series of signed documents implicating the very people Richard had once considered his closest allies. "I can't believe it," Richard muttered under his breath, unable to tear his eyes away from the incriminating documents. "I didn't know they were involved in all of this." The words left his mouth in a daze. It felt like a punch to the gut. The realization that his entire career had been built on a house of cards. The foundation he had so carefully constructed was not made of hard work and integrity, but of deceit and manipulation. It wasn't just the corporation that was at fault. It was the people he had trusted, the ones who had helped him climb the ladder of success. They were not the respectable men and women he had once believed them to be. They were criminals. Elijah's voice cut through the chaos of Richard's mind, his words strangely calm for someone who had just uncovered such dangerous truths. "They're not just deceiving you, Mr. Hayes," Elijah said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. "They're killing people." Richard looked up at the boy, unable to process what he had just heard. Killing people? His mind was racing, unable to make sense of it all. The boy's words had the weight of finality, as if he had been carrying this truth for years, burdened by the knowledge of the danger that had surrounded him. Elijah paused, then continued, his eyes hard with determination. "My mom wanted to leave," he said, his voice a whisper of pain. "But they wouldn't let her go. Now she's on the run because they've threatened her life." The words hit Richard like a slap across the face. The realization settled over him with a horrifying clarity. Elijah's mother wasn't just some innocent woman caught in the crossfire of a corporate war. She had been a part of it, a part of the very world Richard had once inhabited. And now she was hiding, running from the very people who had once been her colleagues, people who would stop at nothing to ensure she didn't expose the truth. Richard's mind spun as he took in the enormity of what Elijah was saying. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing with the gravity of the situation. The boy wasn't just asking for help, he was begging for his mother's life. And somehow that was enough to shake Richard to his core. The world he had built, the empire he had spent his life creating, was no longer a symbol of success. It was a ticking time bomb, a machine of corruption and deceit. And now, the very people he had once trusted were the ones responsible for destroying lives. Richard stood frozen, staring at the documents in front of him, unable to tear his eyes away. The truth was unfurling before him like a dark storm, and he couldn't escape it. He had always prided himself on his business acumen, on his ability to read people and situations, to make deals and close them with the precision of a skilled surgeon. But now, everything felt like a lie. All his achievements, all the power he had amassed, suddenly seemed so small, so insignificant in the face of the horrors he was discovering. He glanced at Elijah, who was standing beside him, his face a mask of quiet resolve. The boy didn't look afraid. In fact, he looked like someone who had seen the worst of the world and had somehow survived. Elijah's calm demeanor in the face of such staggering danger only added to the weight of the moment. This was no longer just about a boy searching for something in a warehouse. This was about a life or death struggle, a battle between survival and destruction. Richard's throat went dry as the pieces began to fall into place. Elijah's mother had been involved in this world, a world of dirty money and corporate manipulation. But she had tried to escape. She had tried to run to save herself and her son, but they wouldn't let her go. The people behind the corporation were powerful, ruthless, and now they were closing in on her. Richard could feel the blood drain from his face. He knew the kind of people Elijah's mother was running from. He had worked with them, sat in meetings with them, shared drinks with them. These were not ordinary criminals. These were the elite, the untouchable, the ones who operated above the law, who played the system to their advantage. They were the kind of people who would do anything to protect their secrets. Richard closed his eyes, the weight of the truth crashing over him like a wave. This wasn't just about corporate fraud. It wasn't about protecting his legacy anymore. This was about saving a life. This was about protecting someone who had once been a part of his world, someone who had risked everything to expose the lies they had all been living. And now, it was up to Richard to decide what kind of man he was going to be. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. Elijah was right. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about justice, and Richard knew that he couldn't ignore what was happening any longer. "I'm not going to let them get away with this," Richard said, his voice low and determined. His words held a finality that surprised even him. He wasn't sure how or why, but something inside him had shifted. The man who had once been consumed by his business, by his wealth, was now focused on something much more important: the truth. And Elijah's mother, whoever she was at the center of it. Elijah looked up at Richard, his eyes filled with hope, but there was a faint glimmer of doubt, too. The boy had seen too much to believe in simple promises, but for a moment, Richard saw a flicker of trust in his eyes. "Thank you," Elijah whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for helping her." Richard nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. They weren't safe. Not yet. The fight was just beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with danger, but Richard was no longer the same man who had walked into that warehouse. He was someone different now, someone who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The files in front of him weren't just a record of corruption, they were a map that would lead him through the darkest corners of the corporate world, and ultimately, to the heart of the conspiracy that had ensnared them all. "We're going to take them down," Richard said, his voice steady and resolute. "All of them." Elijah nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and fear. Richard didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to act. Richard sat at the worn wooden desk in his study, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. The weight of the decision hung over him like a storm cloud, dark and unrelenting. Elijah stood nearby, his small frame tense with a mixture of hope and fear. They had just uncovered a web of deceit that went far beyond anything Richard had ever imagined. The evidence was undeniable, the proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of the corporate world. But as much as Richard knew they had to act, as much as the truth demanded to be exposed, a part of him was terrified of the consequences. The truth was a double-edged sword. It had the power to destroy, to unravel the lives of powerful people who had spent years hiding their crimes in the shadows. But it could also destroy him. Richard had spent his entire career building an empire, a reputation that had made him untouchable in the world of business. If he brought this evidence to the authorities, if he exposed the corruption that had been buried for so long, everything he had worked for, his legacy, his wealth, his power, could come crashing down around him. There would be no turning back. But Elijah's words echoed in his mind. They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. Richard knew that the people behind this fraud were not just ruthless businessmen. They were criminals, capable of anything. They would not hesitate to do whatever it took to silence anyone who threatened to expose them. And that included Richard and Elijah. They were not just risking exposure, they were risking their lives. The question hung in the air, unspoken but omnipresent. Was he willing to give up everything for the truth? Richard looked up at Elijah, his face set in grim determination. The boy's eyes were filled with a quiet desperation, but also a trust that Richard couldn't ignore. This was no longer about business deals or money. This was about a life-or-death struggle. Elijah's mother, the woman who had somehow become entangled in this twisted web of corporate corruption, was on the run. And Elijah, a boy no older than a child in a world full of monsters, was relying on Richard to protect her. "You're right," Richard said, his voice low but firm. "I won't let them get away with this. We're taking this evidence to the police, and I'll face them head on." Elijah's eyes widened, but there was a hesitation in his gaze. "How will you do that?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. "They won't let you walk away from this. They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden." Richard stood up from his chair, walking slowly toward the window. The mansion, with all its grandeur, felt cold now, a hollow reminder of the price of success. The empire he had built, the life he had so carefully constructed, suddenly seemed fragile. But he couldn't let fear control him, not now. "I don't care," Richard said, his voice steady but strong. "I'll protect you and your mom. This is our chance to make them pay." He turned to face Elijah, his eyes hard with resolve. "I've spent my life building something that was supposed to matter, but nothing matters more than doing what's right. And if I have to risk it all to bring these people down, then so be it." Elijah nodded, his expression still guarded but now tinged with a faint glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But Richard heard the gratitude, and it made his chest tighten with something he couldn't quite name. Elijah wasn't just some boy from the streets. He was a survivor, someone who had already lost everything but was still fighting for what mattered. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The decisions ahead would be the hardest of his life. But there was no turning back now. The road they were about to take would be filled with danger and betrayal. The people behind the fraud wouldn't just give up their power, they would fight. And they would fight dirty. As the two of them began to make plans, Richard's mind raced. He knew that taking the evidence to the authorities wasn't just a matter of gathering the right documents and calling the police. It was about exposing an entire network of criminals. A network that would go to extreme lengths to protect itself. Richard's reputation, his influence in the business world, would mean nothing if the wrong people got wind of his intentions. They would make sure that the truth stayed buried, one way or another. And then there was Elijah's mother. Wherever she was hiding, whatever dangers she faced, Richard couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her, what had driven her to risk everything for this evidence. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but the more he thought about it, the clearer the picture became. Elijah's mother had been part of that world. She had been involved in the very corruption Richard had helped build, and now she was running for her life, carrying with her the key to exposing everything. Are we going to get this evidence into the right hands? Elijah asked, his voice breaking into Richard's thoughts. They have so many connections. The police might not even believe us. Richard's jaw tightened, the problem more complex than Elijah could possibly understand. We need to find the right people, Richard said, his mind already calculating the next steps. People who will listen, who have the resources to help us. We can't trust anyone who's already involved in this mess, but there are others who will want to take this down just as much as we do. He paced back and forth, his mind moving rapidly as he thought about his next move. He had connections, people in the legal world, in law enforcement, men and women who had been allies in the past. But even they might not be enough. The people behind this conspiracy were not just businessmen, they were power brokers with reach that stretched far beyond anything Richard had ever known. If he didn't play his cards carefully, he would be stepping into a minefield, and one wrong move could destroy everything. The reality of the situation was hitting him harder than ever. He was not just fighting for the truth anymore, he was fighting for his own survival, and Elijah's as well. Richard couldn't afford to make mistakes. The stakes were too high. "Do you trust me, Elijah?" Richard asked, turning to the boy. His voice was softer now, almost fatherly. He needed to know that the boy wasn't just following him out of desperation. Elijah looked up at him, his eyes steady, unwavering. "I trust you," he said simply. "You're the only one who can help us." Richard's chest tightened. The weight of that trust was immense, but he couldn't back down. He had already made his decision. There was no going back now. They began making preparations to take the evidence to the authorities. Richard knew they had to move quickly. The longer they waited, the more likely it was that the people behind the fraud would catch wind of their plans. But Richard also knew that they couldn't rush. They had to be strategic. They had to make sure the evidence was airtight, that the police would take them seriously. Elijah watched him, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. Richard couldn't promise the boy that they would succeed, but he could promise him one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone take this opportunity away from them. With a final resolute look at the boy, Richard turned and walked to the door. The fight ahead would be long and dangerous, but Richard knew that it was the only fight worth fighting. There was no going back now. They were in this together. "I'll protect you," Richard said firmly, as they headed toward the unknown, the weight of the truth now their only weapon. "We're going to make them pay for what they've done." The path ahead was uncertain, filled with peril and risk, but as Richard and Elijah prepared to face the dangers that awaited them, one thing was certain: they had each other, and together they would face whatever came next. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Richard Hayes' study, casting long beams of light across the room. Outside, the world seemed unchanged, serene, calm, untouched by the storm that was about to break. But within the walls of the mansion, there was a palpable sense of urgency. Richard stood by the large wooden desk, the file that had started this entire ordeal now sitting in front of him. The weight of it felt heavier than ever, as though it contained not just paper but the very future of everything he had built. His business, his reputation, and perhaps his life. Elijah stood beside him, his small hands clutching the edges of his jacket, his eyes dark with determination. The boy was scared, that much was clear, but there was something in his gaze that told Richard this was not just about survival. Elijah believed in something Richard hadn't fully grasped until now. It was justice. It was the belief that doing what was right, no matter the cost, was the only way forward. Richard had been through wars in the business world, had made decisions that weighed on his soul, had seen deals made in shadows that made his stomach turn. He had always thought of himself as a pragmatist, a man who understood the reality of power, of money, of the game. But standing beside Elijah now, he realized that for the first time in years, he felt something different. The boy's presence, his unshakable belief in right and wrong, stirred something in Richard's heart. It reminded him of the man he had once hoped to be before ambition and greed clouded his vision. They had come so far, and yet the hardest part lay ahead. The file, filled with evidence of corporate corruption, illegal activities, and a chain of secrets that stretched to the highest levels of power, would change everything. The people behind the corporation weren't going to let this go easily. They had too much to lose. The risks were enormous. Richard could feel the danger like a weight pressing down on his chest. The forces they were up against were ruthless, powerful, capable of anything. They had the means to destroy careers, lives, and families. Richard had seen it happen before, and now he was standing at the edge of the same abyss. "We're not just bringing this to the authorities, Elijah," Richard said, his voice low but steady. "We're stepping into a battle that could cost us everything." Elijah looked up at him, his expression unflinching. "I know, but we have to do it. My mom, she deserves to be safe. She deserves a chance to live without fear." Richard felt a pang in his chest. He had never truly understood the burden Elijah carried. The boy had already lost so much: his mother, his home, his sense of safety. And yet, here he was, standing tall, determined to fight for justice, even if it meant taking on the most dangerous enemies imaginable. Richard had his own battles, but standing next to this boy, he realized just how small his own fears seemed in comparison to the courage Elijah had shown. "You're right," Richard said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to make them pay for what they've done, but you have to understand, this won't be easy. We're going up against people who will stop at nothing to protect themselves. They'll try to silence us. They'll try to discredit us. And if we're not careful, they'll tear everything apart." Elijah nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I don't care. I just want my mom to be safe." Richard felt a surge of admiration for the boy, a sharp contrast to the doubts that had plagued him for so long. The truth was, he had been prepared to live in a world where power was everything. He had been prepared to turn a blind eye to corruption, to make compromises when it suited him. But standing next to Elijah, he realized that he could no longer look the other way. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way he could walk away from it. The room was silent for a moment as the weight of their decision hung in the air. Richard looked at the boy, his heart heavy but resolute. He had no illusions about what was to come. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, and they would be facing enemies with more power, resources, and influence than they could imagine. But in that moment, Richard made a promise. Not just to Elijah, but to himself. He would not back down. He would not let fear control him. Richard finally picked up the file and held it out to Elijah. "We're doing this, but I need you to understand, Elijah, this is bigger than both of us. It's bigger than any of us could have ever imagined." Elijah reached out, his small hand trembling slightly as he took the file from Richard's grasp. There was no fear in his eyes now, only resolve. "I understand," he said softly, "but we have to try." Richard couldn't help but feel a knot tightened in his chest. This wasn't just a boy asking for help anymore. This was a partnership, a bond forged in the fires of truth and justice. Together, they were going to take on the most powerful people Richard had ever known, and whether they succeeded or not, they would make sure that the world knew what had been done in the shadows. They would make sure that no one else would have to live in fear like Elijah and his mother had. As they prepared to leave for the authorities, Richard's mind raced with strategies. He knew that the authorities could be their biggest ally, but only if they moved quickly, and only if they could get the right people on their side. The stakes were higher than ever, If the wrong people got wind of their plans, they would be in danger before they even had a chance to act. Richard turned to Elijah once more, his face grim but determined. "We can't do this alone. We need help. We need to find the right people who can protect us, the people who will stand by the truth no matter what." Elijah nodded. "We'll find them," he said, his voice steady. "We have to." Richard smiled, a faint but genuine smile despite the weight of the situation. For the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a purpose to his life, beyond just making money or building his empire. There was something more important now, something that mattered more than all the wealth and power he had accumulated over the years. As they walked out of the mansion, heading toward the uncertain future that awaited them, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the boy beside him. Elijah had already proven more courageous than Richard could ever hope to be, and now they were both going to fight for justice, for Elijah's mother, for the truth, and for everything they believed in. Richard had no illusions about the danger that lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to face it, no matter what it cost. The weight of their decision, of the danger that loomed ahead, was inescapable. Richard knew that the forces they were about to face would not back down easily. They would fight tooth and nail to protect their secrets. But Richard was no longer the man who cared only about power or money. He was a man fighting for something much greater. As the car drove toward their meeting with the authorities, Richard looked at Elijah one last time. The boy's face was set with determination, his eyes reflecting the same belief in justice that had first sparked within Richard. The stakes had never been higher, and they were walking into a storm. But in Elijah's eyes, Richard saw something he hadn't seen in years. The belief that doing what was right was worth any cost, even if it meant sacrificing everything. "We'll do everything we can," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet but unshakable resolve. "And if we have to sacrifice, I won't back down." Elijah smiled faintly, a small, hopeful smile, and for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he wasn't alone. They were in this together. And together they would take on the world. Don't forget to like if you find this story meaningful to you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories.